In the year 1600, a single handful of nutmeg was worth more than a house on the grandest canal in Amsterdam. The company that controlled it would become the richest entity in human history. Not a kingdom or an empire, a company, worth by most estimates close to $8 trillion in today's money.
That number is the part everyone repeats. This video is about the part they leave out. Because the Dutch East India Company didn't just become rich, it built the machinery of modern finance, the shareholder, the stock exchange, the corporation itself, and used it to do something no institution had done before. It let thousands of ordinary people profit from atrocity without ever having to see it. That is the real invention worth tracing. The distance. The space it opened between the people who earned the wealth and the things that were done to earn it. Because that distance never closed. We are still living inside it. To understand how big this became, you have to start with the problem it solved. And the problem was spice.
In the 1600s, spice was not seasoning. It was medicine, status, and money all at once. Europeans believed nutmeg could hold off the plague, and nutmeg grew in exactly one place on Earth, a scatter of volcanic islands in what is now Indonesia called the Banda Islands. Reaching them was the hard part. A voyage east took 2 years, and most ships never came back, lost to storms, disease, and war. For a merchant, funding a single voyage meant staking everything on a coin toss between ruin and fortune. So in 1602, Dutch merchants did something that had never been done. They merged their competing ventures into a single enormous entity, the VOC, and then made the move that would quietly reorganize the world. They opened the company to the public. Anyone, a merchant, a shopkeeper, a household servant, could buy a share, a piece of the company, entitling them to a portion of its profits in proportion to what they owned. It was the first time in history a company sold stock to the public, and those shares could be sold on again to anyone at any time. To trade them, the Dutch built the world's first stock exchange, a building where the value of the company rose and fell each day on rumor and news carried by ships still months from home. It's worth pausing on how elegant this was. The coin toss that once ruined single families was now spread across thousands of strangers, each holding a sliver of the risk. One ship lost was no longer a catastrophe. It was a rounding error. For the first time, a person could own part of something vast without ever leaving home or ever seeing what that something did. This is the invention that made the modern world. Every pension, every stock, every startup descends from that room. But it also introduced something quieter and more dangerous, a layer of separation between the money and its consequences. From now on, the shareholder in Amsterdam and the events across the ocean were joined by a single thread, a dividend. And a dividend tells you nothing about how it was earned. With capital pouring in, the VOC could afford what no company ever had, and the exact terms of what it was permitted to do were written down. The Dutch government granted the VOC a charter. Its terms read less like a business license than a description of a sovereign state. The list was short. It could wage war, sign treaties in its own name, mint its own coin, found colonies, and govern whoever already lived there. And it could execute. This was not a company in any sense we would recognize. It was a private empire with shareholders, and it now held a monopoly on the most valuable substance on Earth, with the legal right to enforce that monopoly by force. The men who ran it understood exactly what that permission was worth. In 1621, one of them set out to collect on it. The man was Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, and he had reduced the company's philosophy to a single sentence, which he wrote down himself. There can be no trade without war, and no war without trade. The Banda Islanders had committed no crime the Dutch could name. Their offense was selling nutmeg to everyone, the Dutch, the English, and the Portuguese alike. To Cohen, an open market was a breach of a monopoly he intended to hold completely, and a monopoly that cannot be enforced is worth nothing. In 1621, he arrived at the islands with a fleet, an army, and a force of hired mercenaries. What followed was not a war. Roughly 15,000 people lived on the Banda Islands. Within months, almost none remained. They were killed, starved, or enslaved and carried away. A few hundred escaped to neighboring islands. A people who had lived there for centuries were, in the space of a single season, effectively erased to secure the supply of a spice.
And the machinery held. With the Bandonese gone, the VOC owned nutmeg outright. Every tree, every harvest, and worked the plantations with enslaved laborers it shipped in to replace the dead. It controlled the world's supply so completely that it could name any price. Nutmeg bought in Banda sold in Europe for 300 times its cost.
This became the pattern. Over the next century, the VOC did not merely trade, it conquered, seizing ports, crushing rivals, ringing Asia with fortresses from South Africa to Japan. At its height, it commanded more than 40 warships, 150 merchant vessels, 50,000 employees, and a standing army of 10,000.
To its shareholders, none of this was visible. What was visible was a dividend, roughly 18%, paid year after year for nearly 2 centuries. The violence and the return were the same fact, seen from opposite ends of the world. In Amsterdam, only one end could be seen.
For all its power, the company had already begun to rot from within, and it was structural. The men who ran operations were stationed on the far side of the planet, where a single message took a year to arrive and another year to answer. Oversight was, in practice, impossible. Combine unlimited authority, immense wealth, and no accountability, and the outcome's not surprising. Corruption became ordinary. Officials skimmed profits, ran private trades against the company, and falsified the books, growing personally rich while the enterprise hollowed out beneath them. By the end, the Dutch had turned the company's own initials into a verdict. VOC, they said, stood for Vergaan onder corruptie, perished under corruption. By the late 1700s, the damage could no longer be hidden. The company was crushed under the cost of its own empire. The forts, the soldiers, the fleets that had to be paid for whether or not the profit arrived. The British were taking its trade. Corruption had drained its accounts, and it had begun doing the one thing that reliably marks the end of an enterprise. It borrowed money to pay its dividends. The dividend was no longer profit. It was anesthetic.
It took on debt to pay returns it was no longer earning, sustaining the appearance of 18% with borrowed money, so that its shareholders would never notice that the machine beneath them had already stopped.
There is a modern name for that arrangement: paying old investors with new money to disguise a business that no longer works. We call it a Ponzi scheme. The richest company in history spent its final decades running as one.
Then the wars arrived. Drawn into the conflict between the Dutch Republic and Britain, the VOC saw its trade severed and its ships captured. Revenue collapsed, and the debt it had piled up to disguise its decline came due all at once. Nothing could cover it. The company that had commanded armies and unmade kingdoms simply ran out of money. On the last day of 1799, after nearly 200 years, the Dutch East India Company was dissolved. Its debts passed to the Dutch state, its territories became a colony, and the wealthiest entity that has ever existed disappeared, leaving behind an empire of debt and a record of atrocity. That is the arc in full. From the most consequential financial innovation in human history, the invention of the stock market itself, through conquest and corruption to collapse. In the space of 2 centuries, the same company, the same men, the same machine.
Which leaves the question the whole story has been circling. How did the people capable of building something this sophisticated end up responsible for something this monstrous? And feel nothing? How does the shopkeeper who bought a single share sleep soundly for the rest of her life? 1700 years earlier, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius set down a warning to himself. Wealth and power, he wrote, do not corrupt a person all at once. They do it by degrees, by placing more and more distance between a man and the consequences of his actions, until he can no longer feel them. That distance is the true invention of the Dutch East India Company. Not the share, not the exchange, the space it opened between a person and the results of their own money. Consider the shopkeeper once more. He never saw the Banda Islands. He never heard the name Coon. He collected his dividend twice a year and lived a little more comfortably for it. And the system worked precisely because it stood between his and the truth. It took a massacre and rendered it as a number in a ledger, and rendered that number as a coin in his hand. Clean, quiet, and deniable.
This is what money does once it grows abstract enough. It does not make people cruel. It makes cruelty effortless, because no one along the chain is ever forced to look at what they are funding. The shareholder defers to the officer to the charter to the market, and the profit passes through all of them, touched by everyone and owned by no one.
It's tempting to file this under history, but the arrangement is not historical. Every time you do not know where your returns come from, every time something is profitable for reasons no one can quite explain, you are standing where that shopkeeper stood. The distance did not close. It widened, and we gave it better names.
The Dutch East India Company was the richest entity that has ever existed. Its true legacy is not the wealth. It is the machinery it perfected for not having to look.